So we know there is a pension gap between men and women, and although auto-enrolment is going to improve things, women are still going to face lots of challenges when it comes to building up a pension. So we know that men and women in their 20s contribute to pensions just equally the same, but once women leave the workforce to bring up children, and we know statistically more women leave to bring up children, the gap begins to widen. Even if women do return to work, it's often part-time and they contribute less to pensions. And they often prioritise childcare, and that can lead to problems later on if there is a divorce.
I mean, it came as some surprise to see that of the people that Shoosmiths surveyed, 33% had no idea that they were entitled to share their partner's pension. And if you look at that in the context of 42% of marriages ending in divorce, particularly against a backdrop of the increase in the so-called silver separators, people getting divorced much later in life, and those rates have doubled since the 1990s. It's difficult to pin one reason down as being responsible for this, but there's no doubt in the fact that this is a trend, and we've seen divorce rates amongst the over 50s double since about 1990. A number of things may factor into that. There's obviously the idea of empty nest syndrome when the children leave home. Retirement in itself, finishing work, massive changes, they put pressures on relationships. But what we do see is that people are looking forward to that final chapter, those final years, and they really want to lead their best lives. So every case is unique, but people are obviously taking a decision that they're thinking long and hard about. And it's the right decision for them. But there are financial implications of this. You're often dealing with a mixture of financial resources at that stage in somebody's lives. They will have property. They will hopefully have pensions. They will hopefully have other assets. They may have liabilities that they need to think about. So this creates a level of complexity. And people need to understand their options. They need to know where they stand. They need to know what they may be entitled to. So really the financial implications of this is simply how are people going to move forward with their independent lives in later life, which is going to mean into retirement, in a way which means that they have enough money overall to meet their needs.
And just an additional point on that, the other financial implication could be that people can't retire at the time they had planned to retire. So when people are thinking about retirement when they're much younger, they're planning for retirement as a couple and thinking about a communal pot of money. And that can mean that they've planned to retire at age 60, for example, but because they're getting divorced, they are going to have less money in retirement, and that means that they might have to work on, which might not have been in the plan. So it's thinking about restructuring plans they might have, and certainly that's when taking good financial advice can really help.
Well, hopefully things can be arranged amicably, and taking legal advice shouldn't be a barrier to that. And we would always say that people should feel free to discuss these things, try to reach agreements, and then possibly present this agreement to their lawyers and with discussions with their financial advisors and say, is there anything we haven't thought about? Because the real reason why people need to take advice is so that they know where they stand and they can deal with all of this on an informed basis with everything on the table. So full disclosure of all the relevant assets and issues and a full understanding of what people might need. And then things can be structured in such a way that ensures that as far as possible, the future is as comfortable as it can be. And they're dealing with these things in a way which is not necessarily risk-free, because there's always financial risk in these situations, but in a way where that risk is as low as it can be and manageable. Well, it's interesting that there's this common misconception that if you live with somebody, it somehow creates a legal relationship, this idea of common law husband and wife, and that means when you split up, you're entitled to share in things or receive some maintenance. And in fact, it comes as a shock to many people to realise that that's just not true. The Shoosmiths research showed that probably about a third of people out there believe that they're entitled to some share of their partner's pension, property, if they separate when they've just lived together outside of marriage. And in fact, that just isn't true. So the situation is complicated enough for a married couple splitting up. But for a couple that are living together outside of marriage, they've got a few other things to think about. So really important again to get advice. And ideally not to wait until things are being dealt with at the crisis stage where a relationship has broken down. We're just looking at, well, OK, what am I entitled to? Instead of that, think about it at the beginning of the relationship. Have honest conversations about, well, what will happen if we separate? This house is in your name, not our joint name. So how are we going to cope with that? How are we going to think about our children, each other's estates? Should we make a will? What life insurance do we need? What critical illness cover should we have in place? All of those really important decisions need to be taken jointly and ideally in such a way that everybody knows where they stand and they have some protection, possibly in the form of a document. We regularly prepare a document called a cohabitation agreement, which sets out what the couple have agreed, and that has legal effect. That is the ideal scenario and avoids the distress, the acrimony and the cost of dealing with these things when something's gone wrong.
And when people are cohabiting, they should be regularly looking at their position. So, for example, if a child is born, then perhaps thinking about things like wills again, thinking about if one person's going to be giving up work to look after the child, what impact that will have financially, especially should anything go wrong. And particularly thinking about people who are older when they start cohabiting, if they have children from previous marriages or previous relationships, then that can have a big impact. For example, if they are living in a house which is owned by one person, then having a will is crucial because of the laws of intestacy. So it's really important to know what their position is from a legal perspective, but think about it from a financial perspective as well.